it's about maximising your overall opportunities to get to grass. So whether that's by day for a few weeks and maybe on-off grazing in wetter periods if it's possible, and trying to minimise the amount of time that they're fully housed for if we can achieve that. But ideally, if the conditions are there and grass is available on farm and you have set your farm up to have a high open farm cover to support spring grass availability, then by all means go for it if it's there.
This week we continue our coverage from the Teagasc National Dairy Conference in Limerick. The theme of this year's conference was Robust Dairy Farming for Future Challenges. As part of this year's conference, there were 6 practical workshops which farmers could choose from. These included meeting herd feed requirements next spring, successful use of sex semen in Irish dairy herds, controlling dairy production costs in 2025, managing young calves for better health outcomes, Clover 150, what lessons were learned from 2024, and putting a plan in place for 2025, and finally, trends in TB, reducing risk for dairy herds. We shall hear from presenters from each of the workshops who outline some of the key messages discussed on the day. Firstly, I caught up with Aisling Claffey, Teagasc ruminant nutritionist. Aisling discussed meeting the herd feed requirements next spring. I firstly asked Aisling the actual feed requirement of the calf dairy cow.
So if we look at a typical 600 kilo dairy cow doing, we'll say 25 kilos of milk on average, she's going to need about 17.5 UFLs. That's her net energy requirement to support that milk production in early lactation.
And is that achievable, I suppose, from that kind of early lactation period?
Yeah, so I suppose the big challenge in spring is that mature cow, she starts off at an intake maybe around 13 kilos of dry matter, and that takes nearly until week 10 or 11 of lactation to hit a kind of peak of 20 kilos. So really in those first few weeks, she's really under pressure in terms of energy intake. So some of that will come from body condition score loss to support that. So it's important that we maximise energy intake in early lactation to minimise the amount of negative energy balance she's in and the amount of pressure she's under during that period.
So really you're trying to get as close to that 17 and a 17 and a half UFLs as possible?
We won't get it all in those maybe first 6 weeks in particular, but it's about optimising that period and getting as much energy that we're trying to minimise that deficit that's there, and I suppose keeping it for as short a period as possible.
What feeds then are typically available to farmers, I suppose, next spring?
Yeah, so look, in an ideal scenario, we're looking at cows getting out to grass, and that can be a challenge on a day-to-day basis, depending on soil conditions on farms and the weather that we're facing on a week-to-week basis. But that would be the key one. Look, we're looking at spring grass having a UFL of at least 1 per kilo of dry matter. So the more grass we can get in, the higher we can keep the overall energy density of the diet. Naturally, we're going to be feeding some level of meal through the parlour. So we're focused on having a high energy concentrate for that feed. But I suppose the big challenge where we're not getting to grass is depending on the forage quality in the yard. So look, if we look at the national average results coming back from the labs, we're looking at 68 DMD being the typical silage on farms, and I suppose ideally that's really dry cow silage, but hopefully most farms will have a bank of higher quality feed put aside for that early lactation piece. Ideally 74 DMD plus, but I suppose in a lot of cases we are working at somewhere between that 68 to 72 DMD silage.
What are we talking? A couple of bales of cow?
Yeah, ideally at least 2 bales of cow for that spring feeding. It depends on the soil type too. If you have a very dry farm and a lot of grass and made that effort to close the farm at 700 kilos of an average farm cover this time of year, that you're ensuring that you have that bank of grass, you might get away with close to that 1.5, but heavier farm definitely want 2 bales of good quality silage in the yard as a minimum.
So if there is silage in the yard, make sure that there's enough of it for next spring.
Yeah, and prioritise the best quality feed for that early lactation period.
You looked at a number of diets throughout the workshop. Maybe just to pick a couple of those to walk our listeners through. I suppose the one that's often the case at farm is fully housed on average quality silage, feeding 6 kilos a meal, versus getting that at least 1 grazing per day in Aisling. How do those two diets differ, and I suppose result in cow performance and even economics?
Yeah, so if we look at that 68 DMD silage, which is typical of the national average, with 6 kilos a meal, that diet is really only fit to support about 16 kilos of milk from the diet alone. So that's something we have to be conscious of. poor quality silage, it's about 30% lower in energy than spring grass. It's going to physically limit intake because it's a higher level of fibre in it. So it's going to take more time to break down in the rumen. So there's a number of limitations there when we have poor quality feed going into the diet during that period. So energy intake is going to be compromised with that 68 DMD silage.
Where those cows in some cases maybe are doing 19, 20, 21 litres, is the reality that that's coming off their backs then on that diet?
A big part of it will be coming off the back. You'll see extra condition score lost during that period. And I suppose another factor that we routinely see, and I suppose this spring was particularly challenging, if we look at a lot of co-op reports, protein for March and April was down across the board in farms. And I suppose if you reduce the milk solids of the milk, it takes actually less energy to produce milk. So milk solids suffers during that period if cows are on poor quality silage, and condition score will suffer as well. So like if we look in a normal year, we're hoping that cows will lose a very max a half condition score from that time she calves until coming around to breeding again. So we're going from maybe 3.25 back to 2.75. But I suppose we can very easily lose another quarter of a condition or more during that period if energy density of the diet isn't correct and she's inside for a prolonged period of time.
So we go forward then and we get at least that one grazing in, we'll say at the moment. How does that change the diet? How does that change cow performance?
Yeah, so I suppose that boost of spring grass into the diet will need less meal to try boost up the silage in particular, and it's able to support about 19 kilos straight away, just getting those extra few hours of grass into the diet. So it gives a massive lift in terms of overall performance, and so it will reduce the negative energy balance during that period and taking pressure off the cow. There's also a significant saving in terms of feed costs. So you're looking at going maybe from $4.34 of feed cost per cow per day back to $3.68, and that mightn't seem like an awful lot on a per cow basis, but that's €280 over 100 cow herd per day. So it's $2,000 a week in terms of the actual feed costs. And I suppose I mentioned the milk solids component of that. So we'll get a higher value milk and more milk from our cows if we can get access to grass by day.
And that's really the minimum benefit from a cost point of view, a cost and economic point of view, when you think, I suppose, cows aren't going to be losing as much condition, slurry storage isn't under as much pressure, so obviously there's all of those other kind of
there's a lot
hidden
of
benefits,
hidden costs in the background there as well, not just looking at the likes of your margin over feed during that period. So there's a lot of benefits to be got, just even from getting those 4 or 5 hours to grass, and even from a labour point of view, it takes a lot of pressure off if you can get cows out for a few hours in terms of getting other work done around the yard.
We were talking about getting at least one grazing in, and I suppose that's in these periods where maybe it's difficult and you're on off grazing and so on and so forth. It goes without saying, if conditions are good, the grass is available, you're going grazing and you're taking your 2 bouts of grazing, and that's going to improve the situation again.
It's about maximising your overall opportunities to get to grass. So whether that's by day for a few weeks and maybe on-off grazing in wetter periods if it's possible, and trying to minimise the amount of time that they're fully housed for if we can achieve that. But ideally, if the conditions are there and grass is available on farm and you have set your farm up to have a high opening farm cover to support spring grass availability, then by all means go for it if it's there.
Following on from Ashling, we caught up with Stephen Butler, Principal Research Officer in Teagasc Moor Park. Stephen discussed the successful use of sex semen on Irish dairy farms on the day. I started by asking Stephen to outline the current trends in sex semen usage over the last number of years.
In an area of huge growth in a relatively short period of time. So if we go back to the breeding season of 2021, at that time there was no sex semen lab in the country. We were relying on imports of semen or Irish bulls going abroad to get sorted. But the big issue for farmers were lack of bulls, small bull teams, unhappy with the EBI, and as a result they were staying away from sex semen. In 2021, sex semen lab was set up in Moor Park. In 2022, a second lab was set up in NCBC. And now in 2024, Dovea have also set up a lab. The Moor Park lab has shut down. So we've come a long way in terms of an ability to produce sex semen from the best bulls in the country. And now if you look at the AI company catalogues, all the best bulls are typically available sorted. So in terms of trends in usage, in 2021, before there was a lab in the country, we would estimate about 80 to 90,000 straws were used. And in 2024 breeding season just gone by, somewhere in the region of about 300,000 straws were used. So more than a threefold increase in that short period of time.
Is there a risk, given the increase year on year, is there a risk with a supply issue? And I suppose, what would you be saying to farmers with that regard?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at this from the perspective of an AI company, they have gone and made the investment now in providing sex semen labs for this exact purpose, but it's in their interest to supply sex semen that they know there's a demand for. So we would expect that there'll be an increase in the amount of sex semen used in the 2025 breeding season, given that the demand was large in the 2024. But if you want sex semen and you're going to use it for the first time, you should talk to an AI company, their sales rep or their breeding advisor well in advance and flag that intention or make that order, because if you do it now, there's time for those straws to be made. Sex sorting is a slow process. Those labs are running 24 hours a day right now to make sure that there will be enough sex sorted straws for next year's breeding season. So deciding in late March or April next year that you're going to use sex semen, it might be too late. Those straws might not be available to you. So if you want to use it, make sure that your AI company is aware of that demand.
The workshop is titled around the successful use of sex semen. I suppose, what are the key fundamentals there in terms of making sure it is successful at commercial farm level, Stephen?
Yeah, well, there's a few key things to think about here. So some of it is on the animals you're selecting. So, you've obviously got a team of bulls to pick. So use a large team. You don't know in advance whether a bull is going to be good or poor fertility after sorting. Some of those bulls have never been sorted before. That's one of the features of our seasonal calving system. There will be bulls appearing available with sex sorted semen for the first time, and we don't know if they're going to be good or poor fertility after that sorting process. So use a large team of bulls. That's consistent with ICBF messaging around genetic risk, but also with sex semen, there's a fertility risk. So use a large bull team. And nowadays it is very easy to use a large team of high EBI bulls, and that makes it much easier for farmers. On the dams, you're using the best genetic merit dams, and as a simple rule, try and focus on the top 50% of the herd based on EBI. So you're going to get genetic gain in your herd by breeding your replacements from the best genetic merit animals. So typically we're targeting heifers, but they must be fit and target weight, cycling regularly in the weeks before the breeding season begins. Cows, again, you're trying to identify the best fertility cows in the herd, which animals are likely to have the best predicted fertility performance. So we'll have information on that, when to use it, considering timed AI. Timed AI has some advantages in allowing you to pick exactly which animals you're going to use sex semen on, and facilitates using that sex semen on the very first day of the breeding season, which again is a good strategy for mitigating the risk of any compromise in fertility performance. And then also some details then on the straw handling on the day of AI. So sex sorted straws are, for want of a better word, they're somewhat compromised. There's fewer sperm cells in those straws compared with conventional, and the sorting process can be damaging, and the straw handling on the day of AI is much more critical for sex sorted straws than it is for conventional.
Next up, we hear from Patrick Going, Teagasc Dairy Specialist, and Nora O'Donovan, Teagasc Dairy Advisor, who discuss controlling production costs throughout the day. I started by asking Pat, what can you tell us from the analysis of production costs over time?
The biggest thing I would see over time is that the period from particularly 2015 to 2018 was relatively static from a cost of production point of view. And ever since 2021, the costs of production have gone up a long way. But more so within that, while the average has gone up a long way, so the average in 2023 was about 37.3 cents a litre, what we're noticing is a massive range across all farms. So the average doesn't really indicate exactly what's happening on farm, and each farmer has to go down and look at what's going on, because it's one farm to another. You can't compare by using the average anymore.
Nora, Teagasc have developed a new tool which is specifically a bill of quantities and, looking at what specific inputs are required to run a commercial dairy farm. I believe you've used this with one of your joint programme farmers. Can you maybe just outline what's involved with that?
Okay, so I suppose the first thing is to know what your costs are, and that's your starting point. But after that, then, if you want to see where you can have maybe scope to reduce your costs, that's where you need to delve into what your costs are and be able to compare them. So typically you're maybe comparing to the national average or comparing to other farmers in your area. So for example, with the Desmonds, I went through some of their costs, and one that wasn't even particularly high, we were looking at the veterinary costs. So on the bill of quantities, it showed that if you use the recommended amount of products on the farm as regards your vaccines and your typical number of call-outs for the vet, etc., they were actually a little below that. So that looks grand on paper, that your costs are below this, but when we actually delved into it a little bit and looked at, they had maybe slightly lower costs coming through in, no foot bathing, whereas their actually lameness cost was maybe call-outs for getting hoof pairing or whatever was a little bit higher than what it should be. So that shows them that then, maybe we need to go back, look at doing a bit more foot bathing, spend a bit more money there, and actually maybe have savings on the production side with not maybe losing a cow lame or whatever through the year.
Yeah, and that gives real power, Nora, in terms of being fit to actually delve into specific costs, because often we look at the few big ones, and although they're very, very important, what we've seen is that there's been an awful lot of creep over the last number of years in all other associated costs with run the commercial dairy farm.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially then it's useful in particular as well when you're in a discussion group and you're comparing and you're benchmarking off each other. And I find down through the years that somebody says, "Oh, I had high veterinary costs, but that's because I had an outbreak of somatic cell count, whatever," and that's fine, so be it. But sometimes it's hiding something else that's there in the background as well. So having the bill of quantities to actually really go through all of the specific costs and maybe find somewhere else, and it's all about finding where there's scope to reduce your costs a little bit.
And maybe, Pat, you were involved in putting this bill of quantities together along with Pádraig O'Connor, I suppose. And I think, is it the point that some farmers will be slightly higher on cost than others? And if you can explain that, so be it, that's fine. But it's really to have a look and see, can we lower costs at individual farm level?
Yeah, so what we would recommend is that we need to look at all costs. So we're moved away from being a low-cost country. It costs a fair bit of money now to produce milk in Ireland. And again, as we said already, it's this range. And what we would ask every farmer is to explain the variance. So if you're high at a cost and there's a genuine reason, fair enough. But if you're high in a cost and it's not a good reason, for whatever reason, you need to go in there and address it and fix it. And there's huge scope to do that. Like the average profitability last year in Ireland was about €623 a cow, €623 profit per cow. The top farmers are making over 1,100. So there's huge scope there for farmers to add on profitability. Like, in small changes could add for 10, 15, maybe 20% increase in profitability every year. So whether it's a good year or bad year milk price, we need to refocus on this and make sure we have all our costs under control.
I suppose all of this work is based off the benchmarking data around the farmers completing the profit monitor. We're getting into that season. Not a particularly nice task, maybe, in terms of the gathering the information, Pat. But what would you say to farmers, the ones that are doing it, maybe, but maybe our listeners that aren't actually completing it?
In any business, everyone benchmarks. You have to know your cost of production. Dairy farm now is big business, and we need to make sure that going forward we have control of our costs. Because the biggest thing that's really after happening in 21, 22, 23 and 24 is the variance in milk price. It's up and down, and it's swinging so much within a 6-month period. Now, we were warned about this post-quota, that the milk price is going to go up and it's go down, and it dropped for a little bit in 2016. But every year thereafter was actually quite stable. But at the moment, we're in an awful fluctuations in milk price, and we have to set up our cost of production for the lowest milk price. And that's why we have to refocus and benchmark and do the profit monitor.
Let's hear now from Emer Kennedy, Dairy Enterprise Leader, Teagasc Moorpark, whose session was based on managing calf scour for better health outcomes. I firstly asked Emer what are the main causes of a scour outbreak on a dairy farm.
I think if we look at the main kind of causes, what we're looking at is like your rotavirus, your crypto, that kind of thing. So infectious causes of it. So we want to try and eliminate that. So what we're looking at now, or what you can do this time of year, is that you can make sure that your shed is squeaky clean. So if you haven't cleaned it out properly after the spring, now is a really good time to get in, power hose it down, disinfect it, because you'll have time to let the disinfectant dry out, and then you can be ready for the spring. Also check all your feeding equipment. You know, that should be properly scrubbed down. Do you need to change the teats? Like anything that can harbour any bacteria, it should be nicely cleaned. For example, like crypto is a parasite, and that can be in the cracks of the walls or anything like that in the shed. So you really need to get in there and scrub it out and make sure it's sparkling clean, ready to go for the spring.
So is the starting point now making sure that the calf sheds, I suppose the calving pen as well, as it's a point, but calving pen, calf sheds, they're washed out, they're disinfected, and as you say, the feeding equipment is clean and is ready to go.
Yeah, like this time of year, you know, things aren't as busy on farm. Like a lot of farmers are starting to dry off cows, so it is an ideal opportunity, because before we know it, January is going to be here, the middle and end of January, and calves are going to arrive, and it's a little bit late at that stage. So while you have a bit of time now to get organised, you should check all the equipment, all the pens, and clean it out. And I guess be aware of your 6-week calving pattern. When are the cows going to be at peak calving? Because that then is going to influence the number of calves that are on the ground. Have you enough space for all those cows? Frequently problems arise when we maybe pack pens too tightly with calves. So what we want is about 2 meters squared per calf. So depending on your 6-week calving pattern, the age that you're going to sell calves at, where have you space to mind all those calves for the spring, and what is the plan? So it's a good time now, while there is a little bit of flexibility and time in the system for a bit of thinking, that you can plan it all out for the spring and be ready.
Bedding material as well, and straw is very expensive, and I know I spoke to a particular vet on this, and he said exactly as you said: hygiene, space, and plenty of straw. How important is that for those young calves in terms of preventing ill health?
So the straw is really important. So what you're looking at is basically 15 centimetres of straw. It might sound like a lot, but you want the calves to be able to nestle into it so that they can be nice and warm. It's not just a few wisps of straw that are sprinkled on the ground as a token gesture. The calves have to be able to sit in and nestle into it. If you think of a baby calf, they spend 70 to 80% of their day lying down. So you want them to be lying on something that's warm and comfortable for them to lie in. You can test it with your knee. If you kneel down into the bed and your knee comes up wet, that means the calf is lying on a wet surface, so that's not going to be conducive to good health. But as well as the hygiene, the other critical factor is colostrum management, and you need to get your colostrum spot on. So that's following the 1-2-3 rule. First milking within 2 hours of birth and to feed 3 litres. And then transition milk, particularly if you have previously had issues with rotavirus and you're vaccinating your cows, you need to feed that transition milk for the appropriate amount of time in order to get the antibodies into the calf so that they will have a bit of resistance to it.
Would you be recommending that farmers should be testing colostrum?
Yeah, this is my pet project. I think every farmer should have a refractometer, and what we're looking for is above 22%. And I should also say Black Friday is coming, and farmers should go treat themselves to a new fridge that they can put in the calf shed to store their colostrum, because it's going to last. The colostrum, once you collect it and test it, and it's over the 22%, you put it into the fridge, and within 3 hours of being collected, that's going to last for 48 hours. And when we're at peak calving, the turnover is going to be pretty high. So just to, all you have to do is go to the fridge, get your colostrum out, heat it, not in hot boiling water, in warm water, so 37, 38 degrees, just to warm it up, because the absorption of the antibodies will be better when it's warm. So that's one of the key things.
So put that on the Christmas list is what you're saying. If you're having a refractometer on a fridge for colostrum, get it on the list, folks. You mentioned there vaccination. Is that something that all farmers should be looking at? Some farmers should be looking at. Obviously, some farmers will be carrying it out. What role does it play, I suppose, in preventing scour?
So I think it's probably knowing your herd is I guess the best piece of advice. Some farmers get away and they don't need to vaccinate at all. And you could say if it's not broken, you probably don't need to fix it. But for a lot of farmers, particularly, if there's a lot of compact calving, a lot of calves in a short space of time, maybe the labour isn't available on the farms, issues can arise. So particularly the Rota corona vaccine that can be given to the cows, but the transition milk needs to be fed, and again splitting it. And this year there's a new crypto vaccine on the market, so for people who've had issues with that, perhaps that's something that they should think about as well, because it is a security measure that can help combat against scour.
Very good. I suppose prevention is key, but where we do have that sick calf, early diagnosis, early treatment, how important is that in terms of, I suppose, the success and reducing the spread to other calves?
Yeah, early diagnosis is really important, and correct diagnosis. So, if you wanted another item for the shopping list for Christmas, it could be a scour test kit that you could put onto it. So, you can get five tests there in a box, and just basically take a little bit of the feces or the scour, and it's kind of like a COVID test, and it will tell you, if it's crypto or salmonella, E. coli. So at least you know what you're dealing with then. So then you can take action based on that, and treat the calves appropriately. appropriately. You know, if it's like crypto, that you're using the correct disinfectant if you need to clean out the shed and disinfect it to try and halt the scour outbreak. But yeah, early detection is key. And also, like what some farmers have tended to do in the past is withdraw milk from the calf when they're kind of, you know, trying to get them over that bout of scour. But in reality, you still need to stay feeding milk because that's an energy source for the calf, and that's going to help them to recover a little bit faster. So for example, you might go in the morning and maybe give them their milk, maybe come back with electrolytes, a little bit of milk again the afternoon, more electrolytes in the evening, and then they may or may not need it throughout the night, depending on how severe the case is. But another tip there is that if you are dealing with calves, any sick calves really, that you deal with those last, that you're not going in to deal with those first, because you don't want any of the bacteria that on your clothes that you're then spreading to the healthier calves as you go down through them.
Next up, we have Mike Egan, grassland researcher at Teagasc Moor Park, whose workshop at the conference looked at the lessons learned from the Clover 150 programme and what needs to be done to ensure Clover is successful in 2025. I started by asking Mike if there was a blueprint to establishing Clover on these farms.
The key thing, if we want to reduce chemical fertiliser, which we cannot compromise overall grass production. And one key way of doing that is ensuring we have sufficient level of legumes, particularly white clover and red clover and silage ground, there to sustain that drop in chemical fertiliser. I suppose the key thing is getting that clover in on farms or in paddocks first. And as part of the Clover 150 programme and also the Clover Clover manual as well, we have an establishment blueprint of how to get clover in on farm, and it has to be a two-pronged approach between reseeding and oversowing. And if we look at the programme, it's probably a 5-year programme, but it's much longer than that because we have to maintain it in the swards thereafter. But it's somewhere in the region of 5 to 10% being reseeded per year and 10 to 15% oversown per year as well. So we want to get as close to 20% of our farm per year being put into clover. Now, you could be coming from a level of zero or no clover, or you already may have some level of clover on it. And depending on where you are and the amount of paddocks that you have are suited, it's going to vary within that. But we need to be quite aggressive to ensure that when the reductions come in chemical fertiliser, we have enough clover in place to do that. And to get it in, like, clover is a fabulous plant in terms of fixing nitrogen, but it's quite sensitive in terms of establishment and also soil fertility. So to establish clover reseeding and oversowing, we need to have a soil pH of 6.5. That is first of all, and we need indexes in 3s and 4s for P and K. P is essential for establishment and taproot development, and K then for long-term persistence and stolon production long term. So before we go reseeding or oversowing, we need to ensure that we have good soil fertility in place first, and that we don't pick paddocks to establish clover that are suboptimum for soil fertility.
Is that the starting point, Mike, for our listeners in terms of that you're targeting the areas of the farm where the soil fertility status is good?
I think so. And look, if we wait to get every paddock on our farm optimal for P's and K's and soil fertility, we'll be waiting a long time. So if it's only 2 paddocks that are suited, do those 2 paddocks. If it's 10% of or 15% of your farm, do that 15% of your farm. But the most we should be doing in an individual year is 20%, because it's too difficult to manage more than that in an individual year. So we want to get the soil fertility right, number one. Timing is critical. Clover is a warm season plant, so it likes warm soils and not wet soils. So really, for establishing, spring is the right time for establishing, whether particularly reseeding, but vitally for oversowing. We probably have a very narrow window for oversowing for April and early May, and once we go to that, past that, it gets too dry, too warm, and then too cold as we go into the autumn period as well. So look at soil fertility number one, and then put a clear plan in place to pick your paddocks for reseeding and oversowing going forward. And up to 20% per year is all we should be doing. And in terms of seeding rates, it's somewhere in the region of 1.5 to 2 kilos in a full reseeding mix, and about 2 to 2.5 kilos per acre on an oversowing sward. And grazing management is vital there afterwards to ensure you get light down to the base of the sward.
We've heard already today, 2024 was obviously a very challenging year from a grass growth point of view, but also from a clover contents point of view within these established swards already. I suppose, what have we learned? Some farmers have been disappointed, Mike, in terms of the performance. And how would we maybe adjust our management going forward when we see that?
We know when we have sufficient clover in the sward, we can get in excess of 100 kilos fixation per hectare per year. And that allows us to reduce that chemical fertiliser by the same amount, 80 to 90 to 100 kilos. In order to achieve that 100 kilos of chemical or nitrogen fixation from the clover plant, we need somewhere between, on average across the year, about 20-25% average sward clover content across the year. Now that's varying from 10, 12, 15% in the spring to a maximum of 35-40% then in the autumn. So we know if we have those patterns across the year, we can get that high levels of fixation. Now, the problem with this year was, and it's not just like everyone has said to me whenever I talk about clover didn't work this year. It's not that clover didn't work this year. We could make the same argument for chemical fertiliser. Chemical fertiliser didn't work this year. It's we didn't have the conditions to allow optimum performance of chemical fertiliser or clover in terms of fixation. So if we look at the first 6 months of the year, first 8 months of the year, I think 80% of the timeline was below the previous 15-year mean temperature. So we had a very cold spring. Number one, and then inversely, 4 of the first 6 months of the year were higher average annual rainfall than the previous 15-year average as well. So I said already, clover likes warm, dry soils. We had very cold and wet soils all spring. That reduced chemical fertiliser uptake in terms of response as well because we had lower soil temperatures, but also reduced the level of clover that we had in swards as well. And if we look at the on-farm study, we know that the average sward clover contents in April this year were about 9% back where they were in last year. So if we just look at that solely, we mean we had less clover in the farm systems starting off with. So we can't expect to get the same level of fixation from less clover plants from it. So it's not that clover plants didn't work, it's just we had much lower clover contents in those swards. And in years that happens, we need to increase the level of chemical fertiliser that we're applying so that we don't reduce overall herbage production in the system, because that's going to be a big negative. If we lose overall herbage production in the system, we have to bring in supplementation, and that's costly. So in years that we have lower clover content in spring like we did this year, we need to increase the level of chemical fertiliser that we're applying, number one. And number two, when we have wetter conditions, we need to ensure that we protect the plant in terms of our grazing management and preferential grazing management, that we give it the best chance to recover to the levels. And if we look again from the on-farm study, we had a 9% reduction in clover contents in April. On average, compared to last year, we had a 3% reduction in average sward clover contents in June. But when we got to August and September, there was no variation in average sward clover content this year compared to last year or 2022. So clover content recovered fine. The challenge was the first 6 months of the year. And that's when we need to apply that chemical fertiliser when we don't have the clover. And then when the clover content recovers, we can take out the chemical fertiliser. And when we did that on the on-farm study, we're back up about 30 kilos in the on-farm study this year, and we're probably going to be in the year about 200 kilos ahead in terms of dry matter production this year compared to last year. Pasture-based farms are about 1.1 to 1.1 tonne of a reduction, the average pasture-based farmers in terms of herbage production this year compared to last year. So in years like this, we need to increase the level of chemical fertiliser when clover contents are back, and then take it out to ensure that the clover content recovers and takes over.
Very good. And I suppose as we look forward, what should farmers be planning to do to ensure the good clover contents?
I think what we need to look at now is review pasture performance on your PBI, your pasture-based Ireland report for the last 12 months, identify paddocks that are high performing and look at the level of clover that was on those paddocks, but more importantly, identify paddocks that were poor performing paddocks in terms of overall herbage production, weed content, and put a plan in place to pick paddocks now for reseeding. And likewise then, paddocks that have maybe suboptimal levels of clover or that have good soil fertility, identify those paddocks now to oversow, that we can put a plan in place to get in time, have the seed in the yard and spray in the yard and whatever we need to ensure that we can get reseeding and oversowing in April. That's number one, review your PBI report and identify paddocks for reseeding and oversowing. Second point then is take soil samples in the next couple of weeks, once the timelines have opened, and then look at soil fertility reports and put a clear plan in place for a nutrient management plan next spring. Targeting your P's and K's if you have P allowance and your slurry on those lower performing paddocks or low index paddocks to get them back up to ensure that if they're paddocks we want to reseed or oversow, that they have good soil fertility, not to do it at the timeline that we're reseeding or oversowing. That's too late because the clover needed it immediately. And the third point then is, depending on what level of cover is on these individual paddocks in terms of with high clover content or low clover content, put some bit of an idea around grazing order or grazing preference next spring. if paddocks that have good levels of clover, we want to maintain that level of clover on it. And if they have a reasonably high level of cover or grass production on those now, coming into the winter, try and target those for earlier grazing in the spring. Overwinter or closing cover has an impact on sward clover content. In terms of high clover content, will reduce high herbage production, or high closing cover will reduce average sward clover content, but we can negate that by grazing those paddocks earlier in the spring. So if you have paddocks that have clover in them, have a high cover on them now coming into the winter, try and target those for earlier grazing in the spring, because that reduces the negative effect on it. So review PBI, soil sample, and put a plan in place, and put a grazing order preference in place based on clover content to ensure that we get the best performance of our clover plants in 2025.
Finally, we hear from Damien Barrett, who is the head of the Ruminant Animal Health Division within the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. The workshop Damien was involved in on the day was looking at the trends in TB and reducing risk for dairy herds. I asked Damien if he could outline nationally where the current trends with regards TB were at.
The story isn't great when it comes to TB in Ireland at the moment. Herd incidence level is just below 6%, and reactor numbers are in and around 40,000. This marks a significant increase on last year, when reactor numbers reached 31,000 and the year before 24,000. While the herd incidence has increased, we're seeing outbreaks getting bigger, and that's very, very concerning. And the concern here as well is that residual infection may be gaining ground in some of these herds, and getting the disease out is a priority, and it is of a concern to us all.
I suppose when it comes to dairy herds specifically, is there anything you're seeing specific to dairy herds nationally with regards outbreak size?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing there's a trend for bigger outbreaks in bigger herds, which tend to be dairy herds. It's not like, I just want to clarify for a moment. This isn't a blame game on dairy. It's just the fact of the matter is dairy herds tend to be bigger, and TB tends to get a hold in bigger herds. And it's not, we're not saying that dairy per se there's something wrong. It's just that in bigger herds and the type of management system where you've got cows coming together twice a day, fairly intensive grazing, clearing out pastures, it probably puts the herds at more risk of acquiring infection.
I suppose for our listeners and your messages today through the workshop, what are the actions you'd be asking dairy farmers, I suppose, to undertake to reduce risk to their herds?
One of the key things as in terms of residual infection that I'm concerned about is that we're keen that herds, that there's good attention to detail at testing. Data from England would show that half of herds that have recurrent breakdowns that's because infected animals weren't removed on time. And half of those breakdowns were due to the presence of one infected animal. So one thing I would ask people is, rather than look at the TB test as a chore, it's a tough 2 days, there's no doubt about that. But rather than as a chore to be rushed through, give it attention to detail, that if there's any signals that there TB may be in your herd, get it out as soon as possible. In terms of buying in, we would suggest that you don't buy in from herds that have had a recent history of TB, because there's a chance that some of those animals, while they may have passed the test, they may be carrying infection and the test doesn't detect it. The third thing I would ask people to do is, in terms of what they can, like, the wildlife are involved in the epidemiology of TB, that people fence off sets, not to keep badgers in, but to keep cows back from grazing grass in the vicinity of the sets. The badgers tend to toilet in the area immediately outside the set, so fence that off. The other thing is, in terms of zero grazing, that grass likewise should not be consumed. It should be left behind. That we're concerned that may be contaminated, being brought in fed fresh, and the difference there between that and silage is that silage has got a Wilton soil and the pH goes down, destroying the bacteria. As well as this, I think people need to be aware that badgers really love beet and they really love maize. So break the access to those in yards as well. And like the thing about TB control, it's there's no big single silver bullet here. It's all about doing attention to detail and doing a whole lot of small things well.
Yeah, and I think you make that point. It's an accumulation of all of these things that's going to reduce risk at
Yes.
farm level.
Yes, it's a series of small things that need to be done, and unfortunately, there's no silver bullet on the horizon that's going to fix this. It's a question of controlling what you can control yourself.
That's it for this week's episode of The Dairy Edge. Thanks to all our speakers for their time on the day of the conference, and thanks to everyone who attended. You can access all of the workshop content and presentations at the Teagasc website, teagasc.ie. As always, if you have any questions about this week's episode or have suggested topics you would like discussed, you can send them to us at the following email address: dairyedge.podcast@teagasc.ie. Join us again for another Dairy Edge episode next Monday, and don't forget to rate, review and follow the show on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm James Dunn, and thanks for listening.